Once again, I'm in central Melbourne, looking at sites for old electronic shops. This time, I'm looking at 1933 through to the mid-1960s. Research is a lot easier because all issues of Amateur Radio magazine from 1933 through to 1986 have been put online by PLL VK3YE. I'll look at adverts, note their address and visit the buildings to see if they're still there. In about half the cases, they still are. First of all, a bit of history. By the 1930s, radio had matured and was becoming a common consumer item in many households. However, there is still a strong practical electronics and radio element, and that market was supplied with component stores, where amateurs and others would build their own gear. World War II came. Many amateurs enlisted, but for those who stayed at home, they could do other things. For instance, audio was a big interest amongst amateurs. After the war, and a lot of equipment manufactured during the war became surplus. Surplus equipment became the preferred way that amateurs could get salvaged components, transmitters and receivers that they could modify to operate on the amateur bands. You'll see the sites of some of those surplus stores in a moment. Later on, as surplus equipment dried up, there seemed to be a bit of a lull in electronics stores in the city. Some of them either closed down, became hi-fi or stereo dealers, or moved out to the suburbs, along with much of the population as the suburbs expanded. However, from about the mid to the late 60s, there seemed to be a revival, with more electronic component and other stores once again calling the city home. (167) Queen Street was once Wireless House, the headquarters of AWA in Melbourne. Unlike the Sydney counterpart, the building didn't last and has been replaced by a new office block. AWA was also advertising in 1948, but only giving their Sydney address. Their outlet in Melbourne appears to have closed down. Here at 168 Swanston Street was Veals. Veals was one of the early electronic chain stores and was established in 1911. The original building, as you can see, is still here. This restaurant is 241 Swanston Street and next door is 245. It was here that Veals had their main store. They traded from here from at least 1933 to 1948. The original buildings at Veals are still standing. This is another of Veals' many shops in the city at 490 Elizabeth Street. The old building's still there and it's now a supermarket and liquor store. I think Veals only occupied this building briefly. It was trading here in 1939, but after the war was no longer. Veals had stores elsewhere in Swanston Street and also in suburban Prahran and Camberwell. This is 211 Swanston Street, the site of Homecrafts, a major electronic and radio store. It was trading from here from 1933 to at least 1948. And as you can see, it looks like the original building. Homecrafts occupied this store from 1933 to at least 1948. At that time, they had at least 2 stores in the city. But eventually, the 290 Lonsdale Street took over, and Homecrafts vacated these premises. It's now a Japanese cafe.
Homecrafts still advertised in the 50s. Here's a 1954 ad advertising soldering irons, audio equipment, meters and radio parts. At that time, they were at 290 Lonsdale Street.
This is 290 Lonsdale Street, what used to be Homecrafts, but nothing can be seen of it now. Australasian Engineering Equipment were based here at Evans House, 415 Burke Street in 1936. The building is still well preserved. Australasian Engineering Equipment then moved to 370 Little Collins Street. Obviously a building that's not this one. This is 213 Elizabeth Street, once the home of PLL Wireless Supplies. They were trading in 1939, but I didn't see any trace of them before or after. This jewellery store at 316 Little Collins Street was formerly the home of Kingsley Radio. Founded by Howard Kingsley Love, it was known, amongst other things, for its AR7 receiver, which was made at its factory in Spring Street. Once again, we visit 183 Elizabeth Street.
The highlight of many hams reading was the ARRL handbook, with McGill's proudly proclaiming the arrival of the 1960 edition. Bill Orr's books, in this case all about cubical quad antennas, were also popular.
It's now serviced apartments with a hamburger shop and optometrist underneath, but 191 Queen Street was once the headquarters of the WIA Victorian Division. In 1942, its president was Herb Stevens, VK3YE. Herb was alive and active on the air until well into the 2000s.
VK3UH, VK3UH, VK3JO.
Oh, well, at that stage, it was the sort of depression years. Of course, I joined in with the WIA too. We used to run a shortwave listeners group there for a start, and that was where we learned quite a bit.
100 years ago, people had to make their own multimeters. Buy the meter, make a board, even build all the shunts themselves. Look at that. The resistors there, homemade shunts. This belonged to Herb Stevens, the original VK3JO.
Before opening a store in the city, Ham Radio Supplies were based in Richmond. Here's one of their ads from 1948. Here's a 1954 ad from Ham Radio Supplies. At that time, they were at Hawthorn.
Just down from Motorcycle Alley, Elizabeth Street, is Mars Leather, the former store of Ham Radio Supplies at 323 Elizabeth Street.
Making radios in the city was the Aegis Manufacturing Company. That address is familiar. At 208 Little Lonsdale Street, it's the same as McGrath's. McGrath's was still going as far back as 1948. Here, they are shown stocking Eddystone equipment. At 208 Little Lonsdale Street, nothing exists of their original building. In the 50s, McGrath's were the #1 advertiser in Amateur Radio magazine, sometimes taking up the front cover. This is a 1954 ad for William Willis at 428 Burke Street.
William Willis were here through the 1950s and into the 60s until they moved to 430 Elizabeth Street.
You could buy a VFO module, such as you see here, add a couple of extra valves and an AM modulator, and you're on the air.
This is 319 to 321 Swanston Street, once the home of Waltham's, a post-war disposal store. It was trading in 1954. This is Banana Alley, at one time the place of Waltham's, a major disposal centre visited by amateurs looking for cheap war surplus components and equipment to assemble their amateur radio station. It was here in 1954 and some years after. We once again pass 359 Lonsdale Street, formerly the home of Warburton Frankie. They started advertising in 1960, though they were established before then.
In 1963, Warburton Frankie was the test equipment king, with a large range of multimeters available. In case Americans are wondering, yes, we had Heathkit down here, although quite a high price, and I don't think they were all that popular compared with building from scratch. Anyway, the local dealer was Warburton Frankie, based at 359 Lonsdale Street. In a couple of years, they were to move to South Melbourne.
This is Myers Emporium. Across the walkway is Melbourne Central. On the south side of it is 280 Lonsdale Street. That used to be the home of United Trade Supplies, a popular disposal outlet. This is 282. This building, which is unoccupied, could be 280. And I'm guessing this one, a Chinese restaurant, could be 278. The first ad I had for them is 1966, and they were still going in 1969.
Their products included test equipment, transmitters, even transistors now, crystals, and more. An ad like this would have been quite exciting, especially for the amateur starting out.
Next to it is Melbourne Central, and you can see what was Homecrafts at 290 Lonsdale Street. Nothing remains of it now.
This is an Eddystone receiver ad from R.H. Cunningham, at that time trading in Armidale. You could buy black boxes in 1957. This was an AM transmitter using the Geloso dial and VFO. R.H. Cunningham had also moved into the city by 1969. Here they're advertising the 940 communications receiver. Their address, 608 Collins Street.
This has been our look at old radio shops in Melbourne from the early 1930s through to the mid-1960s. For a look at Melbourne's radio and electronic shops from the 1960s to the 1990s, please see parts 1 and 2.
Just a reminder that if you're looking for a comprehensive operating manual on all aspects of low-power amateur radio, don't go past minimum QRP. Available from Amazon for under US $5. For more information, go to VK3YE.com and follow the link, or go to Amazon and type in minimum QRP.